Picture this. It's 1967. Main Street, small-town America. A father and son walk through the heavy glass doors of Western Auto. The walls are lined floor to ceiling with gleaming hunting rifles, shotguns displayed like trophies between spark plugs and motor oil. No background checks, no waiting periods, just cash on the counter and a handshake. The boy picks out a .22 rifle for his birthday, while his father buys brake pads for the family station wagon. This wasn't unusual. This was America. 1 year later, everything changed. The Gun Control Act of 1968 slammed shut a chapter of American retail history that seems almost impossible to believe today. Western Auto, once a retail empire with over 2,000 locations across the United States, stood at a crossroads. The stores that had seamlessly blended firearms with fan belts, ammunition with air filters, were suddenly forced to make an impossible choice. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to Western Auto after the legislative guns fell silent? To understand what was lost, you need to understand the scale of what Western Auto represented. Founded in 1909 in Kansas City, Missouri by George Pepperdine, Western Auto wasn't just a store chain, it was the backbone of American automotive culture and rural life. By 1960, Western Auto operated over 1,200 company-owned stores and supplied more than 4,000 associate dealers across North America. Walk into any small town from Montana to Mississippi, and you'd find a Western Auto store anchoring Main Street, its red and white sign promising everything a man needed to keep his car running and his family protected. The firearms department wasn't some dusty corner of these stores. It was prime real estate, often positioned right at the front entrance or along the most visible wall. Rifles hung in neat rows on pegboard displays. Handguns rested in glass cases beneath the counter. Boxes of ammunition were stacked like canned goods in a grocery store. The 1963 Western Auto Catalogue, a telephone book-thick monument to mid-century consumer culture, dedicated dozens of pages to firearms. A Marlin Model 99 semi-automatic rifle sold for $39. A Stevens single-shot 12-gauge shotgun went for $24.95. These weren't specialty items. They were impulse purchases, sandwiched between pages advertising socket wrench sets and car batteries. The business model was brilliantly simple. Western Auto understood something fundamental about their customer base. The same man who needed a carburetor rebuild kit probably lived somewhere he needed to hunt deer for winter meat or dispatch vermin threatening his livestock. The same teenager saving up for chrome hubcaps might also want a hunting rifle for opening season. There was no cognitive dissonance in this mixture. Auto parts and firearms occupied the same cultural and practical space in mid-century America. Both were tools, both were necessities, both were sold with the same casual efficiency. Then came 1963. November 22nd, President John F. Kennedy assassinated in Dallas with a rifle purchased through the mail from a Chicago sporting goods company. The weapon was a 6.5mm Carcano, ordered from an advertisement in American Rifleman magazine for just $21.45. Lee Harvey Oswald never walked into a store, never showed identification, never spoke to a human being. The rifle arrived at his post office box like any other package. The national shock created the first serious momentum for federal gun control legislation in decades, but the initial response was surprisingly muted. Despite public outcry, comprehensive reform stalled in Congress for years. Western Auto and thousands of retailers like them continued business as usual. The catalogs kept coming. The rifles kept selling. America wasn't ready to change yet. Then came 1968, the year everything broke open. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in Memphis with a Remington Model 760 Game Master purchased at a Birmingham gun store. 63 days later, on June 5th, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was shot dead in Los Angeles with an Ivor Johnson cadet revolver bought at a Pasadena pawn shop. 2 assassinations, 2 firearms purchased with stunning ease. The political will that had been building for 5 years finally crystallized into action. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Gun Control Act of 1968 into law on October 22nd. The legislation fundamentally restructured American firearms commerce. It ended mail-order gun sales entirely. It required all firearms dealers to obtain federal licenses. It mandated record-keeping for every transaction. It prohibited sales to minors, felons, and those adjudicated mentally incompetent. It banned interstate handgun sales and restricted rifle and shotgun sales across state lines. Most importantly, for retailers like Western Auto, it created a framework of regulations, paperwork, and liability that transformed casual gun sales into a serious legal undertaking. Western Auto faced an existential decision at every single one of their locations. The company could comply with the new regulations, obtain federal firearms licenses for each store, train staff on the complex new requirements, maintain the required paperwork, and accept the liability that came with being a licensed dealer. Or they could simply stop selling guns and focus on their core automotive business. The decision wasn't uniform. It couldn't be. Western Auto operated through a hybrid model of company-owned stores and independent associate dealers, each with different ownership structures, different local markets, and different appetites for regulatory compliance. In the immediate aftermath of the law's passage, chaos rippled through Western Auto's corporate structure. Imagine the scene at headquarters in Kansas City. Product buyers who had spent decades cultivating relationships with Winchester, Remington, and Savage suddenly found their entire category under review. Store managers from coast to coast called in with questions nobody could answer yet. What forms needed to be filed? What records needed to be kept? How long would the licensing process take? Could they continue selling their current inventory while waiting for federal approval? The firearms inventory itself presented an immediate problem. Western Auto stores collectively held millions of dollars worth of rifles, shotguns, handguns, and ammunition on their shelves and in their warehouses. This wasn't merchandise that could sit indefinitely. Guns don't spoil like produce, but they do tie up capital, occupy valuable retail space, and now, under the new law, represented potential legal liability if not handled correctly. The corporate directive came down quickly: liquidate. The Great Western Auto gun sale of late 1968 and early 1969 was like nothing American retail had seen before. Stores that decided not to pursue federal licensing slashed prices to move inventory before the regulatory deadlines hit. Rifles that sold for $50 in the catalog now went for $35. Shotguns were marked down 40%. Handguns, which faced the strictest new regulations, were practically given away. Hunters and collectors descended on Western Auto stores like bargain shoppers at a going-out-of-business sale. Because in a sense, that's exactly what it was. An entire category of American retail was going out of business. Some stores made the opposite choice. The company owned locations in major metropolitan areas where gun sales had never been a huge profit center anyway, quietly phased out firearms and expanded their automotive parts selection. Walk into a Western Auto in Chicago or Philadelphia in 1969, and the space where rifles once hung now displayed alternators and radiator hoses. The transition was so smooth that casual customers might not have noticed. The stores simply became what their name suggested they should have been all along: automotive suppliers. But in rural America, the story played out differently. The associate dealer in a Montana town of 3,000 people faced a completely different calculation. For him, firearms weren't a side business. They were often 20 to 30% of annual revenue. Deer season meant as much to his bottom line as Christmas did to a toy store. The federal firearms license wasn't an obstacle. It was a necessity. These rural dealers paid their $50 licensing fee, filed their paperwork, installed the required security measures, and became part of a new era of regulated gun sales. The split created a strange bifurcation in the Western Auto brand. By 1970, the company existed in two simultaneous realities. In urban and suburban locations, Western Auto was purely an auto parts retailer, competing with Napa and Pep Boys on the strength of their private label Wizard brand batteries and True Tone electronics. In small-town America, Western Auto remained what it had always been, a general store for the automotive age, where you could still buy a deer rifle and a distributor cap in the same transaction. The only difference now was the paperwork. This dual identity created operational headaches that corporate headquarters never fully solved. National advertising campaigns had to account for the fact that not all stores sold the same products anymore. Catalogue production became a nightmare. The 1970 catalogue included firearms, but with asterisks and fine print explaining that these items were only available at participating locations. Customer confusion was inevitable. A man in Connecticut might see a hunting rifle in his Western Auto catalogue, drive to his local store, and find nothing but automotive parts. Trust eroded with every disappointed customer. The cultural shift was even more profound than the business impact. Western Auto had been a mirror reflecting mid-century American values: self-reliance, mechanical competence, practical preparedness. The stores said something about who Americans believed themselves to be. The presence of firearms alongside auto parts wasn't a political statement. It was a statement about rural life, about hunting as a normal part of the cultural landscape, about personal responsibility as an assumed default. When the guns disappeared from half the stores, something intangible disappeared with them. Some of the most fascinating stories come from the stores that tried to resist the change entirely. In isolated pockets of the South and rural West, a handful of Western Auto Associate dealers simply ignored the new federal requirements. They continued selling firearms the old way: cash transactions, no paperwork, a wink and a nod. These weren't political radicals making an ideological stand. They were businessmen in communities where everyone knew everyone, where the local sheriff bought his spark plugs from the same counter where teenagers bought their first hunting rifles, where federal regulation seemed like an abstraction from a distant world. This couldn't last. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, newly empowered by the 1968 law, began compliance sweeps in the early 1970s. Agents visited retailers across the country checking for proper licensing and record keeping. The Western Auto dealers operating outside the law faced a simple choice: comply immediately or face federal prosecution. Most came into compliance. Their brief resistance wasn't ideological enough to risk prison time, but a few simply stopped selling guns rather than submit to what they viewed as government overreach. The firearms disappeared from their walls overnight, leaving rectangular ghosts on the pegboard where rifles had hung for decades. The economic impact on Western Auto as a corporation was significant, but not catastrophic. Financial records from the early 1970s show that firearm sales had represented approximately 8 to 12% of total company revenue, with wide variation by region. Losing that revenue hurt, but the automotive parts business was growing fast enough to compensate. American car ownership was exploding. The interstate highway system was complete. Suburban garages were filling with multiple vehicles. DIY auto repair culture was at its peak. Western Auto pivoted hard into this growth market, expanding their parts inventory and positioning themselves as the friendlier alternative to traditional auto parts warehouses. But something was lost that couldn't be measured in revenue percentages. Western Auto had been more than a place to buy things. It had been a gathering place, a cultural institution, particularly in small towns. The old-timers who congregated near the gun counter, swapping hunting stories and arguing about the merits of different calibers, didn't migrate to the alternator aisle. They drifted away. Some went to dedicated gun shops, which proliferated in the 1970s to fill the retail vacuum left by department stores and general retailers abandoning firearms. Others simply stopped coming to Western Auto altogether. The store became more specialized, more focused, more efficient, and less central to community life. The associate dealers who continued selling firearms found themselves in an increasingly complex regulatory environment. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was just the beginning. Additional regulations followed throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Record-keeping requirements became more stringent. Background check procedures evolved. Liability insurance premiums increased. Each new requirement raised the cost and complexity of firearms retail. Every few years, another handful of Western auto dealers decided it wasn't worth the hassle anymore. The rifles came down from the walls. The display cases were repurposed for tools or electronics. By 1980, fewer than 30% of Western auto locations still sold firearms. The company had grown to over 1,400 stores, but the gun-selling locations were increasingly concentrated in rural markets where no alternative retailers existed. In these communities, Western Auto wasn't choosing to sell firearms as a strategic business decision. They were fulfilling a community need that nobody else would meet. The local Western Auto was often the only place within 50 miles where a farmer could legally purchase a rifle for predator control or a shotgun for bird hunting. The physical artifacts of this transition are hauntingly present in abandoned and repurposed Western Auto buildings across America. In a former store in rural Missouri, now converted into an antique mall, you can still see the mounting brackets where rifle racks were bolted to the wall. In a building in Oklahoma that became a thrift store, the pegboard behind the counter still has the distinctive rectangular outlines where firearms once hung. The paint protected from sun fade by the guns themselves. These ghost impressions are everywhere if you know where to look. They're archaeological evidence of a retail culture that vanished within a single generation. The strangest survivors are the catalogs. Thousands of Western Auto catalogs from the pre-1968 era still exist in attics, basements, and estate sales across America. Opening one is like discovering a time capsule from an alien civilization. The casual juxtaposition of deadly weapons with mundane household goods seems surreal to modern eyes. On page 47, a lever-action rifle perfect for deer hunting. On page 48, a set of steak knives and a chrome toaster. No irony, no cognitive dissonance, just products for sale to ordinary Americans. Collectors now prize these catalogues, particularly the firearms-heavy editions from the early and mid-1960s. A mint-condition 1965 Western Auto catalogue can sell for over $100 on eBay. Historians study them as primary sources documenting American gun culture before the modern regulatory era. The prices are particularly striking. A catalogue from 1967 shows a Remington 870 Wingmaster shotgun selling for $79.95. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $700 in today's money. The same shotgun sells for over $500 now, suggesting that despite widespread perception, firearms haven't dramatically increased in price relative to other consumer goods. Western Auto itself began a long, slow decline in the 1980s. The company faced mounting competition from specialized auto parts chains like AutoZone and Advance Auto Parts, which operated more efficiently by focusing exclusively on automotive products. The big box revolution of the 1990s further eroded Western Auto's market position. Walmart and Kmart sold the same Wizard batteries and private label tools at lower prices. The company changed hands multiple times. Stores closed by the hundreds. By 2003, Western Auto was effectively defunct as a retail operation, though the brand name persisted as a parts supplier for independent mechanics. The final firearms-selling Western Auto store closed sometime in the late 1990s, though pinpointing the exact location and date is surprisingly difficult. The company's fragmented ownership structure and the independent nature of many associate dealers means there's no central record. It's possible that some rural dealer kept a hunting rifle or two behind the counter well into the 2000s, selling them under a federal license that still listed Western Auto as the business name even though the corporate parent had long since disappeared. Today, only a handful of Western Auto buildings still stand and remain recognizable. Most have been demolished or so thoroughly renovated that their original purpose is invisible. But in small towns across the Midwest and South, you'll occasionally spot one. The distinctive mid-century modern architecture, the large plate glass windows, the faded ghost sign painted on a brick wall, Western Auto Associate Store. Some have been converted into breweries or coffee shops, the pegboard walls now displaying craft beer taps instead of rifles. Others sit empty, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. The few that survive as museums or historical sites rarely acknowledge the firearms chapter of Western Auto's history. In Independence, Missouri, a restored Western Auto building operates as a vintage advertising museum. The displays focus on automotive culture, featuring old neon signs and vintage car parts. The gun-selling era is mentioned briefly in small text on an informational placard. It's a sanitized version of history, edited for modern sensibilities. The reality that you could once buy a rifle as casually as buying a fan belt makes contemporary visitors uncomfortable. It's easier to focus on the wholesome nostalgia of classic cars than to confront a past where deadly weapons were ordinary consumer goods. Perhaps the most poignant survivors are the physical firearms themselves. Tens of thousands of rifles, shotguns and handguns purchased at Western Auto stores between 1950 and 1968 still exist. They're in gun safes and closets across America. Many owners don't even know their weapon's retail origin. A grandfather's hunting rifle, passed down through generations, might have been bought at Western Auto during a Saturday morning shopping trip in 1964. The rifle has no marking indicating its point of sale. No museum will ever collect it. No historian will ever document it. But it exists, a tangible link to a vanished retail world. Some of these Western Auto firearms do occasionally surface in interesting contexts. In 2011, a Marlin Model .336 rifle sold at a gun show in Texas still had its original Western Auto price tag attached to the barrel, $34.95. The seller, a collector who specialized in retail history, had purchased it from an estate sale. The original buyer had purchased the rifle in 1966, taken it home, stored it in a closet, and apparently never fired it. 50 years later, it existed in perfect time capsule condition, complete with the original hang tag and warranty card from a store that had been defunct for decades. The regulatory framework that killed Western Auto's gun business has itself evolved beyond recognition. The Gun Control Act of 1968 has been amended, supplemented and complicated by decades of additional legislation. The modern firearms retail environment, with its computerized background checks, multi-page forms, waiting periods, and state-specific regulations, would be completely alien to the Western Auto clerk who sold rifles in 1967. The simplicity is gone forever. Whether that's progress or loss depends entirely on your perspective. What's undeniable is that something changed in American culture, and Western Auto was caught in the middle of that change. The stores were symptoms, not causes. They sold guns because their customers wanted to buy guns, in the same transaction where they bought oil filters and windshield wipers. When society decided that firearms required special treatment, that they couldn't be sold like ordinary consumer goods, Western Auto had to choose. Most chose to abandon guns rather than become specialized firearms dealers. They chose to remain auto parts stores rather than transform into something else entirely. There's a broader lesson here about American retail and American culture. Western Auto thrived in an era when general stores could still exist, when one business could serve multiple needs for a diverse customer base. The regulatory pressure that ended their gun sales was part of a larger trend towards specialization, toward segmentation, toward the idea that different types of products require different types of stores. You buy guns from gun stores. You buy auto parts from auto parts stores. The idea that one business could successfully do both seems quaint now, almost naive. The associate dealers who tried to maintain the old model, selling both auto parts and firearms in the same small store, were fighting against more than just regulation. They were fighting against the entire direction of American retail evolution. The future belonged to big box stores and specialty chains, not to hybrid retailers trying to be everything to everyone. Western Auto's gun business died because the law changed, but it probably would have died anyway, just more slowly, as the economics of specialized retail gradually made the old model unsustainable. Walk down Main Street in any American small town today, and you can still sometimes feel the ghost of what was lost. The empty storefronts, the faded signs, the sense that these streets once served a purpose that no longer exists. Western Auto was part of that world, a world where local businesses, local dealers, local relationships defined commerce. The rifles hanging on the wall weren't just products, they were symbols of a particular relationship between seller and buyer, one based on trust and familiarity rather than paperwork and federal oversight. The end came quietly, gradually, without drama or fanfare. No final Western Auto gun sale made the newspapers. No historian marked the closing of the last firearm-selling location. The transition was so spread out over 30 years that nobody noticed when it was complete. One day, there were Western Auto stores that sold guns. Then there were fewer. Then fewer still. Then none. The change was so incremental that it felt like nothing had changed at all, until you looked back and realized an entire world had vanished. What happened to Western Auto after 1968 was a slow dissolution of identity. The stores that gave up guns became just another auto parts chain, distinguished from competitors only by their private label brands and increasingly outdated store layouts. The stores that kept guns became anachronisms, holdouts from a previous era, operating in communities too small and too isolated for modern retail trends to fully penetrate. Both paths led to the same destination: irrelevance. The buildings are mostly gone now. The rifles sold decades ago are scattered across the country, most separated from any memory of where they were purchased. The catalogues are collectibles, prized for their historical value rather than their practical use. The brand name exists only as a parts supplier for independent mechanics, known to almost nobody under 50. Western Auto has become a memory, and not even a particularly vivid one. Most Americans who remember the stores at all remember them vaguely, as part of a general nostalgia for mid-century small-town life, rather than as a specific retail phenomenon. But for those who look closely, the evidence remains. The faded paint rectangles on old pegboard, the mounting brackets still attached to walls, the catalogues in antique stores, the rifles in gun safes passed down from grandfather to grandson. These fragments tell a story about an America that was, about a retail culture that mixed the mundane with the deadly without a second thought, about a time before regulation and specialization and federal oversight transformed how we buy and sell the most basic tools of rural American life. The mystery of what happened to Western Auto isn't really a mystery at all. It's a story of adaptation and abandonment, of economic pressure and regulatory change, of slow erosion rather than sudden collapse. Some stores changed, some closed, none survived unchanged. The Western Auto that sold rifles and spark plugs side by side exists now only in memory and historical record, a retail fossil from an era that feels simultaneously recent and impossibly distant. The guns fell silent, not with a bang, but with a whisper, as thousands of store managers quietly took down their rifle racks and decided that the future belonged to someone else.